I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for this introductory lesson on state open meeting laws. This class will feature a local journalist sharing stories of government bodies inappropriately holding executive sessions. These are secret meetings that are allowed only under certain circumstances. You'll hear how these meetings occurred and how they affect the public's right to know. If you haven't already, please view our previous lessons on open meetings, state public record laws, and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. They can all be found on our YouTube channel as well as in our FOI guide at NEFAC.org. Before we begin this lesson, a special thanks to those helping us make these classes happen: the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, SPJ New England, the Rhode Island Foundation, MuckRock, and the New England Society of News Editors. We appreciate everyone's support. Now, to introduce you to today's instructor, NEFAC's Emily Sweeney.
Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe, and I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is part of our ongoing series on state open meeting laws. This session is going to focus on executive sessions in New Hampshire. And with us is Jonathan Van Fleet, the editor of the Concord Monitor. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through some of this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. So in New Hampshire, we often refer to these executive sessions as non-public sessions. And so this is happening in Concord, New Hampshire, where this all went down. And we had a reporter here, Caitlin Andrews, who has now moved up to Maine, and she works at the Maine Monitor, but she was a former New England First Amendment Institute fellow. And so she was covering the city council back in July of 2018. And the agenda had basically a routine non-public session at the beginning to talk about negotiations. So she covers the meeting, and she's texting me at the meeting and being like, there's some funny business going on. And so we kind of got down the next day. I was like, well, what's happening? So at the very end of the meeting, and this had been kind of going on for a while, but Caitlin was playing kind of really heads up stuff and really wanted to bring this to a head, and she was kind of calling foul on this. At the very end of the meeting, after all the public had left, the mayor made a motion to then bring up a negotiated contract for approval, and he gets a second. And then they bring it up for a vote, and they all vote unanimously, and there is no discussion whatsoever. End of meeting. Thank you. Everyone goes home. And so it's like, how did that happen? It was not on the agenda. There was no public notice that this was going to happen. And furthermore, without any debate, you got to think that there's some sort of a plan that they had. So we asked them for the copy of the contract the very next day, and they said, no, you can't have a copy of the contract until it's signed by both parties. And we're like, this is not right. And I want to say, before we get too deep into this, I don't view these people as kind of evildoers as much as I think they're just sometimes dismissive of the public and dismissive of us as journalists because we're not lawyers or whatnot. So one of the things that we did is we wrote our own right to know request. Here, I sent it in because I felt that this was worth pushing a little bit further. And, I told them some of the things that we felt, primarily that the preamble of the right to know law in New Hampshire affords citizens the greatest possible access to the records and actions of government bodies. And so we felt that given the greatest possible access, something had to be more than what they were doing. Because if you boil it down to us, in essence, the public had no notice of when contracts would be up for a vote. They had no information before those contracts were up for a vote. And even more so, after those contracts are voted on and approved, they were not given any information about the cost of these contracts until up to 2 weeks later, until both parties had signed it. So we're talking about the greatest possible access. And I couldn't imagine a scenario where there was less public access than what they were doing. So write this letter, felt very good about ourselves, felt very strongly about this letter. And then a few days go by, and then they send us a letter back. And this is what I mean by them being very dismissive. Pretty much they said that all of the records that we had asked for, we couldn't get because they were still sealed as part of the vault of non-public negotiations or protected by attorney-client privilege. And they further justified their own actions by saying that it would be illegal for them to tell anybody about what had been negotiated before it was voted on. And so we read this thing, and we have a term for this in the newsroom. We call it FBS, which is short for freaking BS. So we go through this thing, and now we start to kind of talk to them. We start going back and forth. We're pushing back on them because in New Hampshire, every year there's town meeting, and the people get to vote on these types of contracts all the time. There's the cost items there. There's the details. All of this stuff is laid out in every town and city across New Hampshire. So we say to Concord, what are they doing something illegal by giving the public access? And they're like, well, we can't do it. It can't be done. And then we went one step further and said, well, look, we've done some research, and it seems that you are the only place in New Hampshire that does it this way. And their response was, well, we don't know that. And we said, well, you can go check it out. You can look it up for yourselves. And they said, well, we don't have time to do that. And that's when it got us to the point where, okay, fine, game on. It's our job to inform the people of how Concord is doing things differently. So then we start moving into actual journalism mode beyond just fighting behind, email. We're now going to make this public. And so Caitlin gets to work and documents all of this stuff. And this is worth noting because I think we've all published stories about transparency that once they come out, we feel very strongly about these stories, and we're waiting for the public outrage to happen, and it never comes. So it's not like the public was beating down City Hall's door to get into these meetings. To the contrary, that was the city's excuse to us. Well, no one really cares but you. And they made it an issue between us and them. We're just being, malcontents over here at the newspaper. No one cares. Much ado about nothing. So in this case, we did something different. And it proved pivotal to actually make a difference in the long run. Instead of talking to an individual lawyer or an expert on the right to know law, what we did is we emailed all of the lawyers, the top 4 lawyers that we knew in New Hampshire that were really big about public transparency, the right to know law, and RS 891A, which is the law. And so it was Gilles Bissonnette at the ACLU. It was Greg Sullivan, lawyer for the union leader, and Bill Chapman, lawyer for the Monitor, and a guy named Rick Gagliuso, who was a lawyer for the Nashua Telegraph for a long time. So we email all of them the same email and say, hey, everyone, here are the cards. Take a look at what's happening. What do you think about this? So as a result of sending that email to each of them, having them respond and then be quoted in the story, they are now invested in the story. They are now the stakeholders that are basically telling the public why should they care. So if you remember, the meeting started way back in July of 2018. And so months have gone back and forth that we've been working on all of this stuff. And so we decide to publish the story during Sunshine Week, and there it is. And the Sunshine Week, as many of you know, it's in March, and we kicked off our week's worth of coverage with this story. And it really went through that whole process of back to the beginning, that this is not by accident, that this is by design. They are deliberately having these non-public sessions they are and lining up their votes and deliberately not putting these things on the agenda, and deliberately, as part of their plan, bringing them up at the end, no time for discussion, approving them. And so therefore, this story finally comes out, and we're able to document it in a way in the front page of the Sunday paper. And we felt, again, pretty strongly about this. We're not really sure what's going to happen next. The story kind of lingers, and then the next day, Gilles Bissonnette from the ACLU emailed us and says, "Great story. Can I talk some more to you guys about all of this?" And so what that was a beginning of dialogue where he went to the city and discussed with them about how they could change their practice. And so faced with a legal threat, which is often the city's reasoning for doing things. Well, we can't do it another way. We would get sued, they said. Well, doing it this way meant they might get sued. They voluntarily decided to change their practices to come into line with every other municipality in New Hampshire. So now, ahead of votes, they will put cost items on the agenda. So that's a small victory, I think, for public transparency in New Hampshire. It wasn't a huge watershed moment, but it was something that had been going on for years and years and years. It is something that they had put into practice, and it took a reporter who was tenacious and aggressive to say, enough's enough. I'm going to call this out. I'm going to use my time to point out to them why we think this is wrong, runs afoul of the spirit and letter of the law. So they volunteered to give us the cost information the next time a contract comes up. And they did. They put something on the agenda, and we were looking because they had said they were going to. And this time they come out and they say, okay, we've put the cost items out there. The cost items say it's going to be 2.75% increase. And I may have been a little cheeky with this email that I sent to the deputy city attorney, but we were like, how about the actual cost of the cost items? Because percentages are not dollars and cents. So we went and we asked them, and a little time went by, but eventually they answered all of our questions. So before the meeting happened, we were able to report in an advance story that a contract was up for a vote. And here are the cost increases that have been negotiated by both sides. And the public was informed. So the next meeting comes, and we're expecting the city hall chambers to be flooded with the public members who we've fought for this information. Now they're going to be like, we think this contract's too high. We think this contract's too low. And no one showed up. And the city said, say no one cares anyways. But I don't believe that people don't care. They care because they want us to be looking out for it on their behalf. Just because they don't show up doesn't mean they don't value the information. And now they are given that information ahead of time. And so again, I feel like this was a pretty significant win for transparency in New Hampshire. And again, it was the stakeholders that really made the difference for all of us in New Hampshire.
That's awesome. It's so nice to hear. It's kind of refreshing to hear like a straight up victory. And you're totally right. You guys made like lasting change. That's really good.
Well, and so not on the technical side, right? One of the reasons that that boards and public bodies can go into executive session or non-public session is negotiations, right? If both sides are negotiating the terms of this agreement, they don't want that stuff out publicly because it can affect the tone and tenor of negotiation. So that is a hallowed exemption, right? And the city of Concord had a legitimate negotiating team. Their legal argument was that negotiations could restart at any given point, and therefore negotiations were never effectively closed until the contract was ratified, which is an extreme, I think, abuse. It's what we're talking about here. It's an extreme interpretation of the law that we had not seen before. And really, if you think about how they and many municipalities view the law, it's through the keyhole of exemptions. They look at everything from the bottom up. How can this be rejected? Where can I say no? As opposed to, well, my job is to provide the most possible access, the greatest possible access. And so therefore, how can I make this public? As opposed to, I think many times they sit there and they think, how can I make sure this is not public? And it's justifiable to them when they say, oh, it's just us versus the newspaper. And then we write a story and we beat our chests and we're like, rah, we're the newspaper. And then nobody shows up at the next public meeting.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, that's the thing, especially with these open, meeting law like violations that we've been covering in this webinar series. It's amazing to see, but people would have never ever known if there wasn't a journalist there, looking things over and finding out that things were being, covered up in some way.
And true, like I'll give it back to Caitlin in many respects, because she wasn't the first reporter who had encountered this. It had been going on through other reporters. She was the reporter that was like, I've had it. I've had enough of this, and then brought it to me. And then we followed up the right to know request. We got in the back and forth, the legal back and forth with the city, and it turned around.
This has been really enlightening, and again, nice to see something ending on a positive note. Kudos to you guys up in Concord for going after this.
Thanks. Yeah, one of the things that I was going to bring up as well, part of the city's general pushback was that if people wanted to comment about contracts, they would do it at the city budget time. So each year the budget comes together and talk about a dense document that people don't really participate in. It's a city budget process. And yet they're saying that's the time where people can go and say what they feel about the fireman's contract and the policeman's contract and all of that kind of stuff. And yet when it comes time for the budget, the city council generally says, well, times are tough, but we don't have a lot of flexibility in this budget because 80% of it is already spent through the contracts we've negotiated. And so if you follow that logic, the time for people to go and talk about the budget is exactly when they would say they have no control over the budget. So the only time that they really had an opportunity was before these contracts were passed, and the city made sure that nobody ever had an opportunity to discuss things before. And if I was really pressed to ask myself why they wanted to do it that way, is they did not want to hear any dissenting voices. They really didn't want the public to be aware. They didn't want people to harangue them and tell them what to do and then have to vote in the opposite direction. And since it's happened, there have been some other vocal city councilors that have been arguing for greater transparency, but it's a 15-member board, and generally those voices of transparency are counted in the 1 or 2, and the majority of the board still operates in this type of manner. Another big fight we've had with them, and it doesn't have such a stellar record of success, is the city manager in Concord is the highest paid public official here. He makes about $220,000 a year, which by Massachusetts standards is not a lot, but up in New Hampshire, that's a lot. And the governor, by contrast, makes $135,000, $139,000. So the city manager in Concord makes a really lot of money. And we have a weak mayor. The mayor is really a figurehead. He has no power. It's a city manager who has all the power. So we've argued that the city manager's evaluation and his compensation when they vote on his contract should be held in open session, that they should discuss his performance publicly. They have maintained that as a employee, he's entitled to personnel privacy, much like the dog catcher would be, or the math teacher, or the garbage collector. But we have long maintained that he's the CEO of the city, that he has a higher stature. He's a public figure. And so the privacy argument that they have tried is misplaced at best. And so we usually write about that, and we have been unsuccessful to get them to open up the city manager's contract, which they will go into non-public session for, to discuss the compensation of a public employee. And then they come out and they vote and they say, oh, we just gave them a new contract. And we say, can we get the contract? And they say, it'll be posted on our website in the next 72 hours. So that is something where we've pushed and fought, and they just don't really believe that type of stuff belongs in the public eye. We disagree entirely, because if he's doing a great job, then say so. And if he's not doing a great job, the public has a right to know that he's not doing a great job. And so when we make that argument, their retort to us is that if the people want change, they should vote out the city council. They should elect new members who would then elect a new city manager. But as I said, there's 15 of them. So the fact that the public would get together and say, we're all unified on this one issue, so we elect 15 new city councilors who will now hire a new city manager, seems a little beside the point and far-fetched. That's not what's going to happen. So another extreme example of them twisting these executive session rules, these non-public session rules, to basically shield from the public eye the things they don't want people to know.
Jonathan, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Anytime. Thank you so much.